There's something haunting about seeing a kid who once lit up every room with curiosity now drifting through life with a blank stare. They used to finish books before you even started chapter 2. They asked deep questions about death, about time, about the meaning of the universe when other kids were just learning to tie their shoes. People called them gifted, brilliant, born for greatness. But now, years later, they're stuck, staring at the ceiling at 2 a.m., wondering what went wrong. If that sounds familiar, if you were that kid or no one, then buckle in. You're about to hear the real reason why so many smart kids grow up lost and what no one ever told you about the psychology behind it.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more profound insights.
From a very early age, being smart wasn't just about learning faster. It was about sensing more. Smart kids aren't just quick at math or language. They often feel things deeper, notice patterns others miss, and absorb the emotional climate of a room without being told. This heightened perception creates a strange double life. On the outside, they're praised for their intelligence. But on the inside, they often feel isolated, misunderstood, and pressured to always perform. The tragedy is that no one explains this inner tension. Everyone just expects them to succeed, like it's inevitable. But that expectation can quietly become a cage. Here's what most people miss. Being intellectually gifted often comes with emotional intensity. That means the smart kid doesn't just think more, they feel more. They feel rejection more deeply. They feel confusion more painfully. They feel boredom more destructively. And when their emotional needs aren't met when they're told to just be grateful, stop overthinking, or get over it, they start to split. A part of them begins to disconnect from what they feel because it's not safe to express it. And over time, that emotional disconnection grows into a full psychological drift. That drift shows up in subtle ways. The kid who used to be driven by curiosity starts to procrastinate. Not because they're lazy, but because they're overwhelmed by invisible expectations. They start to avoid challenges, not because they're incapable, but because their self-worth has become tied to always winning, and failure feels like death. They become perfectionists, chronic overthinkers, or emotionally numb. They may even self-sabotage consciously or not because deep down, they fear that being successful will only tighten the noose of expectations around their neck. And here's where the real mind bender comes in. Many smart kids were never taught how to fail. They were praised for being right, but rarely supported when they were wrong. So they internalized a dangerous belief that their worth is tied to their intelligence, and their intelligence is proven by always being correct. That belief becomes a psychological trap. One mistake, one wrong answer, one moment of confusion, and suddenly, their entire identity feels like it's collapsing. So what do? They stop trying. Not because they don't care, but because their inner world is screaming, if I fail, I'm nothing. Now think about this. When was the last time you tried something risky, knowing you might fail? If you're hesitating to answer, you're not alone. For the smart kid who never learned emotional resilience, risk becomes terrifying. They'd rather stay in limbo than face the possibility of falling short. And that's where the drift becomes a spiral. They stop growing. They start hiding. They become brilliant minds trapped in fear. And the people around them say, "You have so much potential," without ever realizing how much pain that sentence carries. Let's talk about the word potential. It sounds like a compliment, right? But to the smart kid who's lost, it feels like a curse. It's a reminder of everything they were supposed to become but didn't. It's a mirror reflecting who they were at 8 years old compared to the mess they feel like at 28. And the cruelest part, the smarter the kid, the sharper the awareness of this gap becomes. They know they're not living up to their own expectations. They can feel time slipping. They can see others moving forward. And yet they're stuck paralyzed by fear, perfectionism, and the ghost of their younger self. So what do? They start numbing, scrolling endlessly, watching videos late into the night, overthinking every small decision, fantasizing about success without taking action toward it. Not because they're lazy, but because their mind is overloaded with conflicting thoughts. What if I try and fail? What if I succeed but still feel empty? What if I'm not as smart as they thought I was? These questions aren't conscious most of the time, but they're always humming in the background, like a low-frequency anxiety that never shuts off. Here's something you might never have thought about. For many smart kids, school was the first place they learned to betray themselves. They learned to give the answer the teacher wanted, not what they believed. They learned to chase grades, not wisdom. They learned to suppress their real questions, their real confusion, because the system rewarded speed and certainty, not depth and reflection. Over time, they became experts at wearing the smart mask. But inside, they were starving. Starving for meaning, for authenticity, for a space where they could explore without being judged. And that's why so many smart kids end up lost in adulthood. They were trained to perform, but not to live. They were taught how to impress, but not how to connect. They were given knowledge, but not wisdom. So when life throws real complexity at them, relationships, identity, purpose, they freeze. The playbook they used to win in school doesn't work in life. And now they're left with a haunting question: who am I when I'm not being impressive? This is where the existential crisis begins. It's not about career or money or failure. It's about identity, about meaning, about the terrifying realization that intelligence alone doesn't guarantee fulfillment. In fact, it can sometimes create the illusion of progress while you're emotionally stuck. Because you can explain your pain in perfect detail, but still not know how to heal it. You can understand yourself deeply, but still feel paralyzed. That is the paradox of the lost smart kid. They know what's wrong, but they don't know how to move forward. So what's the way out? It starts with unlearning. Unlearning the belief that your worth is tied to your performance. Unlearning the idea that failure is fatal. Unlearning the need to be the smartest person in the room. It means reconnecting with the part of you that existed before achievement. The part that was curious, not just ambitious. The part that asked questions without needing gold stars. The part that felt wonder, not pressure. But reconnecting with that part of you isn't easy. It requires silence, honesty, the willingness to disappoint others in order to be true to yourself. It means grieving the identity you built to survive so you can create one that allows you to thrive. And that grief is real. It's painful to admit that the path you were praised for might not be the one meant for you. But it's also the beginning of freedom. Here's a question that might change everything. What would you pursue if you weren't afraid of being mediocre? If you weren't trying to prove you're smart, what would you actually love to learn? If no one was watching, what would you create? These aren't just hypothetical questions. They're keys. Keys to a life where your intelligence is no longer your prison but your playground. The truth is, the smart kid isn't gone. They're still there under the burnout, under the fear, under the years of pressure. They're just waiting for permission to be curious again, to explore without performance, to feel without shame. And you can give that permission to yourself. Not tomorrow, not when you have it all figured out, but now. What? Because the moment you stop trying to live up to your potential and start trying to live into your truth, that's when the real journey begins. That's when the smart kid isn't lost anymore. They're just finally free to wander. There's something profoundly unsettling about knowing you were once ahead of the curve and now feeling like you're not even on the right track. It's not just about falling behind, it's about questioning whether the path was even yours to begin with. For many smart kids, adulthood becomes a slow unraveling of all the stories they were told about who they are. You were supposed to be brilliant, successful, extraordinary. So why do you feel ordinary, confused, or even invisible? That question doesn't go away. It lingers, gnaws, and quietly erodes your sense of self. Let's talk about that erosion. It usually doesn't happen all at once. It starts with small disappointments, grades that didn't match your effort, relationships that didn't reflect your depth, jobs that drained you rather than inspired you. Over time, you begin to question whether your intelligence even matters. You look around and see others succeeding not because they're smarter, but because they're more consistent, more resilient, more adaptable. And suddenly, being gifted doesn't feel like a gift anymore. It feels like a burden you can't put down. And here's the psychological trap. You start comparing your current self to your former self. You remember the kid who was praised, who was told they were different, who thought big and dreamed bigger. And you wonder, what happened to me? That question becomes a weight. It creates guilt, shame, even despair. Because you're not just mourning lost time, you're mourning a version of yourself that you believed was supposed to save you. And when that version disappears, you're left with an identity crisis too complex for words. But let's go deeper. What if that early identity was never fully yours? What if being labeled smart at a young age locked you into a role you didn't choose? You started performing intelligence instead of exploring it. You started solving problems not because you cared, but because it earned you praise. And slowly you became disconnected from your authentic motivation. You stopped learning for joy and started learning to survive. You weren't being curious, you were being efficient. And that efficiency turned your mind into a machine that no longer knew how to wonder. This is where the existential fatigue begins. You're not tired because you worked too hard. You're tired because you've been suppressing your real self for years. Living in performance mode takes a toll. Constantly anticipating expectations, trying to stay ahead, trying not to disappoint, it's like emotional high-stakes poker every day. And eventually, even the sharpest mind wears down. Not from failure, but from the exhaustion of never being allowed to just be. Now think about how this plays out in relationships. The smart kid turned adult often struggles with connection. Not because they don't care, but because they've learned to hide their vulnerabilities. They've been taught that their value comes from being extraordinary, not from being real. So they overthink their emotions, intellectualize their problems, and withdraw when things get too messy. They crave depth, but fear exposure. They want to be seen, but only if it's on their terms. And that paradox keeps them alone even in a crowd. And when they do find someone who sees through the mask, it often feels terrifying, because now the stakes are higher. If someone sees the real you and rejects it, that's not just failure, it's confirmation of your deepest fear, that maybe you were never enough to begin with. So instead of risking intimacy, you retreat into solitude. You build elaborate mental worlds, chase distractions, or numb out with endless stimulation. Not because you're antisocial, but because you've never been taught how to be emotionally safe with others. Let's pause and ask a hard question. When did you start believing that being loved depended on being exceptional? Can you trace it back? Was it the teacher who praised your test scores but ignored your sadness? Was it the parent who celebrated your achievements but overlooked your anxiety? Was it the classmates who envied your answers but never invited you in? These moments matter. They plant seeds of belief that grow into the rules we live by. And one of the most toxic rules is this: if I stop being impressive, I'll stop being loved. But what if you could rewrite that rule? What if your worth has nothing to do with your performance? What if your deepest value comes not from your mind, but from your presence, your story, your humanity? This is the turning point. When the smart kid finally stops chasing external validation and begins the internal excavation. When they stop asking, am I enough? And start asking, who am I beneath all the noise? This process is not easy. It often begins with a breakdown, mental, emotional, or even spiritual. Not because something is wrong, but because something false is collapsing. The identity built on being the best, the brightest, the fastest, it starts to crumble under the weight of real life. And what's left isn't failure, it's freedom. Scary, raw, unfiltered freedom. The freedom to be average. The freedom to rest. The freedom to not know. The freedom to be in process. And in that space, something beautiful happens. You start to rediscover your curiosity. Not as a tool for success, but as a way to reconnect with yourself. You start asking questions again, not because you want the right answer, but because you want a real one. You start to learn slowly, deeply, for the sake of learning itself. That's when the magic returns. When learning becomes play, not pressure. When thinking becomes exploration, not escape. You also begin to rebuild your relationship with failure. You stop seeing it as evidence of your inadequacy and start seeing it as part of the process. You realize that failure doesn't define you, it refines you. That intelligence isn't about never being wrong, but about being brave enough to keep going when you are. This is the emotional maturity that most smart kids were never taught. The kind that says, I can be brilliant and still be broken. I can be gifted and still be growing. And perhaps the most healing realization comes next. You're not alone. There are millions of smart kids who grew up feeling the same way, who felt lost, burned out, disconnected, who thought they were the only ones struggling. But smart doesn't mean invincible. Gifted doesn't mean immune. And pain doesn't make you weak, it makes you honest. When you start speaking your truth, you'll find others who've been waiting for someone to say what they couldn't. So what now? What do you do with all this insight? First, you forgive yourself for the years you spent performing, for the relationships you pushed away, for the dreams you shelved out of fear. You forgive the younger you who didn't know any better, who tried their best with the tools they had. You stop punishing yourself for not becoming the person others expected. And you start becoming the person you were always meant to be. Next, you slow down. You stop racing towards some imaginary finish line. You allow yourself to rest, to breathe, to feel. You treat your mind not as a machine, but as a garden, something to be nurtured, not exploited. You give yourself time to grow in directions that may not look impressive, but feel deeply right. And most importantly, you reconnect with your heart. You let your emotions back into the room. You stop hiding behind intellect and start honoring your inner world. You let yourself cry when you're hurting, laugh when you're joyful, speak when you're scared. You stop trying to be a concept and start being a human. Because in the end, the real tragedy isn't that smart kids get lost. It's that they think they have to stay lost to prove they were ever smart at all. But you don't. You're allowed to change. You're allowed to start over. You're allowed to be someone new. There's a moment on the journey of every lost smart kid where something inside finally clicks, not in the mind, but in the soul. It's the realization that the path forward isn't about fixing yourself, but about remembering who you were before the world told you who to be. That moment doesn't arrive with fireworks or applause. It often comes in silence, in solitude, maybe during a long walk or a late-night breakdown. But when it comes, it's unmistakable. It's the moment when you stop trying to be extraordinary and start choosing to be whole. The truth is, no one prepares you for the emotional weight of being labeled smart. They tell you it's a blessing, but they never mention the invisible expectations it creates. You were praised for your potential, but not taught how to process failure. You were admired for your insights, but not shown how to manage emotional intensity. You were expected to lead, but not allowed to rest. And over time, being smart became a performance instead of a presence, or a mask instead of a mirror. But here's the paradox. The mask you wore to survive is the same mask that now suffocates you. You can't breathe under the weight of always needing to be on, always needing to impress, always needing to be more. That pressure doesn't create greatness, it breeds disconnection. Disconnection from your joy. Disconnection from your body. Disconnection from your purpose. And when you're disconnected for too long, even your brightest gifts begin to dim. This is where we begin to understand that intelligence by itself is not enough. It needs to be grounded in self-awareness. It needs to be balanced by emotional literacy. It needs to be rooted in values deeper than achievement. Because a sharp mind without a centered heart can become a weapon against others and against yourself. Your mind can rationalize your procrastination. It can justify your avoidance. It can explain away your pain. But none of that leads to healing. Healing happens when you stop using intelligence to escape yourself and start using it to understand yourself. Ask yourself this: when was the last time you felt proud of yourself without needing someone else to notice? When was the last time you did something purely because it lit you up, not because it made you look good? If you can't remember, it's not because you failed. It's because you've been in survival mode. And survival mode doesn't allow for joy. It only allows for coping. But you're allowed to step out of that mode now. You're allowed to live, not just function. One of the most important shifts we can make is going from performing worth to embodying it. Performing worth means you're constantly trying to prove you matter through success, through knowledge, through perfection. Embodying worth means you know you matter, even when you're not achieving anything. It's a radical act of self-trust. And it's terrifying at first, because without the performance, who are you? But that question isn't a threat. It's an invitation. An invitation to meet yourself without the applause. And when you start meeting yourself in that way, you'll notice something strange and beautiful. The world doesn't fall apart. You don't become lazy. You don't become irrelevant. You become real. You become grounded. You become someone who doesn't need to be the smartest to be valuable. Someone who doesn't need to win every time to be worthy of love. Someone who can walk into a room and just be no mask, no armor, no script. This is emotional adulthood, the stage where you stop outsourcing your identity and start building it from within. It's not about rejecting your intelligence, it's about integrating it. Letting your brilliant mind serve your deeper truth instead of running from it. You don't stop being smart, you start being wise. And wisdom isn't about answers, it's about presence. It's about holding space for uncertainty, for contradiction, for vulnerability. It's about being okay with not knowing and still moving forward. And that movement, no matter how small, is everything. Because the way back isn't a giant leap. It's a series of gentle returns. Returning to your curiosity, returning to your body, returning to your creativity. It might mean picking up a hobby you dropped years ago. It might mean journaling without editing yourself. It might mean having a conversation you've been avoiding, first with yourself, then with someone else. These small acts aren't just self-care, they're self-rescue. And as you begin to rescue yourself, you'll find that your relationships change too. You'll attract people who value your authenticity more than your intellect. You'll feel safer showing your full self, not just the polished parts. You'll stop needing to always be right and start focusing on being real. That shift creates deeper bonds, built not on admiration, but on mutual understanding. Because the people who love you for your mask will disappear when you take it off. But the people who love you for your truth, they'll stay. You may also begin to notice how the systems around you reinforce the smart kid trap. Schools that reward memorization over exploration. Workplaces that value productivity over purpose. Cultures that praise early success but ignore emotional sustainability. You'll start to see how you were shaped by forces that had nothing to do with your natural rhythm. And that awareness can be painful, but it's also liberating. Because once you see the system, you can stop blaming yourself for how it affected you. And as you let go of blame, you make room for something else. Compassion. In compassion for the kid you were. Compassion for the adult you're becoming. In compassion for the journey you've walked, even when it didn't make sense. Because beneath the lostness, beneath the burnout, beneath the fear, you've always been trying to find your way home. And every step, even the wrong ones, have brought you closer. So where do you go from here? You begin to rebuild. Not from pressure, but from purpose. Not from fear, but from freedom. You start small. You define success on your own terms. You stop asking, "What should I be doing?" and start asking, "What feels deeply right?" You listen more. You force less. You trust the process. And slowly, the lost becomes found not in the way you expected, but in the way you needed. You realize that being smart was never the end goal. It was never about being better than others. It was about having the tools to understand this complex, beautiful, painful thing called life. And now, with those tools in hand, you get to write a new story. Not the story others wrote for you. Not the story of endless potential and unbearable pressure. But the story of a human being learning to be here, fully, honestly, imperfectly. So if you're a smart kid who's now lost, hear this: you are not broken. You are becoming. You are not behind. You are unfolding. You are not alone. You are exactly where your deeper self needs you to be, to finally wake up, to finally come home, to finally start living your truth. The world doesn't need you to be a genius. It needs you to be whole. And that journey, it starts right now.